AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's the Santita Jackson Show, the second hour. It's a joy to be with you as we talk about Bloody Sunday, as we talk about voting rights, as we talk about the Selma to Montgomery March. And it's something very interesting that's happening, too, because, Dr. King gave his life to the poor, in service of the poor. Many people do not know that he really grew up at the upper rung of the black world. His father was the pastor of one of the biggest churches in the country. His parents even attended the Gone with the Wind premiere, Dr. David Gibbs. Their choir sang at the premiere. This was the segregated South, the segregated United States. And so to see Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. and Mrs. Alberta King on the red carpet in 1939 is quite stunning. But he's descended from that stock. And yet he gave his life over to the poor. And that's telling, because right now, the poor are being crushed as never before. We are living through yet another golden age. And when you see the displays of wealth, we're seeing not just millionaires, but we're seeing billionaires, not just billionaires, but super billionaires who are about to become trillionaires, the likes of which we have never seen. Oh, we've heard of the Rothschilds and others who have wealth that is just uncountable. But we have more publicly super wealthy people than we have ever seen in history, really. So what is going on? Because in the wake of the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of these acts to make America more progressive and more inclusive, we now have, well, the empire striking back. I guess that's just the best way to put it. But it's been happening since the end of that glorious period when the fight became a little different, became treacherous in another way. And Dr. King predicted this the night before his death. He said, I've seen the promised land. I might not get with you. And he did say in that speech that there were some treacherous days ahead. Dr. Gibbs, he said, but I believe in you. I believe you're going to get there. But make no mistake, it's going to get tough. And so we have been talking, I've been urging you to get this book, The Revolt of the Rich, how the politics of the 1970s widened America's class divide. Because that's what we're seeing now. And it's happening, it's just kind of happening at the upper echelons of the executive branch. I mean, you're seeing Elon Musk on record, the wealthiest man on earth, at least in terms of the public face. No one counts the wealth, the untold riches of the royal family. They own whole countries. But somehow or another, that's kind of forbidden for discussion. I mean, the fact is, he had, according to press reports, Washington Post and New York Times, he and the Secretary of State, whatever you think about Marco Rubio's politics, he was vetted by the Senate and he was let in. He was confirmed. And so Marco Rubio said, hey, you step in. I am supposed to be here. Who are you? Ouch. So what does all of this mean, everybody? What does all of this mean? But let's step back to Bloody Sunday. Because this is I don't want it to be lost on us what a game-changing moment that has been in American life, in the world, because it's something that people talk about all over the world. People talk all over the world about the American Civil Rights Movement, the American Civil War, because America really is a beacon for a lot of people and for all of us in the world. Whatever the problems we have here, this experiment is something that is really incredible. And that having been said, let's go back to Bloody Sunday. Let's talk about the significance of it and how this newly freed people, these people who had been enslaved but who never stopped fighting to move forward in this country, as they pushed through, there was pushback. And we've seen the pushback grow and grow and grow to where we are today. But I think you need to understand the civil rights movement, all of those gains, and then what happened in the 1970s. Because Dr. Gibbs, we did get Baki. We did get a lot of pushback on affirmative action. Everything that was fought for, everybody pushed back on. So let me go back because you're an historian at the University of Arizona, brilliant, and I've so enjoyed getting to know you over the past few years. And I urge everyone to get the book, The Revolt of the Rich: How the Politics of the 1970s Widened America's Class Divide. We need to understand that because that is what Americans are seeing right now. We're feeling it. So let's talk about it. But let's go back to Bloody Sunday and what that meant. Because I mean, for a white mother, Viola Liuzzo, the wife of a union leader, to leave her 5 children, knowing how dangerous it was, and her husband, and she was murdered. Working in that march, she just saw what happened Bloody Sunday, and Reverend James Reeb saw what happened to Jimmy Lee Jackson. He said, and he left. This is a white minister who left his wife and children, and they murdered him. A white mob murdered him. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a World War II veteran, I mean, my goodness, murdered, trying to vote. He said, now, when I went away to this war, you said that things were going to change for me. They haven't changed. So let's go back to that moment because I want us to get a sense from you. I want us to understand what that period was about, what it was like. Why was it significant?
As I understand it, the earlier civil rights marches against segregation at lunch counters and such in the 1950s were mostly just black people. They did not yet get, initially, there was not significant numbers of whites who joined them at first. And by the 60s, with the Freedom Rides, you started getting a more multiracial group protesting in the South, at risk to themselves. Selma was the high point of that, where it was a significantly multiracial group at this point, opposing segregation. I think the national attitude clearly was starting to move on this. You began getting something close to a tipping point in that I think what was happening was that the American establishment outside of the South was starting to tire of segregation because it was not in their interests anymore for a number of reasons. One was the Cold War. It was seen as of propaganda value to the Soviets that, here the United States calls itself democracy. They make this big announcement about how democratic they are. And look what happens in the South. And the United States American officials began to find that damaging to the all-encompassing, to the objective of fighting communism, that it made the United States look bad. So I think that's a larger context. Another context was, of course, Adolf Hitler had gone a long way to making racism an unattractive idea by 1945. So there was the overall context. And then he began getting mass demonstrations, first by black people, then, as I said, multiracial. And I think it was very shocking. This is an era of TV. You began seeing these images on TV. I was much too young. I think I was 6 years old at the time, so I have no memory of any of this. But I gather that people older than myself were seeing on television these horrific scenes of these white state patrolmen in Alabama and elsewhere in the South with German Shepherd dogs attacking people and clubbing them, bashing their heads in many cases. And that was so shocking. I think, of course, the result of this, as we know, it was indeed a silver lining. The silver lining was, by August of 1965, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1965, passed both houses of Congress. He signed it into law, and it set up a federal machinery to enforce voting rights. The 24th Amendment had already, the Constitution had already been passed the previous year, banning the poll tax by not act of Congress, but as a constitutional measure. So this was a period when attitudes were changing, and I think one of the things that did help change it was the fact that people did not take these things lying down. They went out in the streets and demanded change. And so I think Selma, as I said, was the high point of when you really reached a tipping point that things really began to move.
Why do you think, just, as you step back and examine history, why, what do you think it was that moved whites to get involved? I mean, because then Harry Belafonte was able to rally a mixed group of people. I mean, this is, mind you, after the March on Washington, where Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte brought in, and Charlton Heston and Marlon Brando. They rallied all of these people from Hollywood: James Garner, Diane Carroll. I mean, Lena Horne. I mean, and it was a multiracial delegation that came in.
Right.
That had been reaching critical mass for some time, but something was different about Selma. Was it the deaths? I mean, just in rapid fire succession. Do you think?
I think the death. I think again I gather there was much more footage of just these horrific attacks by the Alabama State Police and the demonstrators who weren't doing anything to require that kind of violence. There was a peaceful demonstration. There was no significant fighting back taking place.
Mhm.
And this was an era of television. Television was still relatively new back then, and it brought into everybody's living rooms what was going on in the South and what it looked like. And the fact that I think that it is true. There's no doubt that it was a multiracial group. America was then, as now, about blacks were 12 to 13% of the population.
Mhm.
In those days, Hispanics were not yet such a large group, so it was overwhelmingly still a white majority, a large white majority. And they ran the country. We still do, I suppose. And the fact is basically that when this was a multiracial group and they could see people of both races were getting their heads bashed in. And so, yes, that did have some effect, I think, on people's attitudes. And so I think so Selma really was, in a certain sense, where it all came together in terms of really swaying public opinion, that segregation is really an ugly artifact of the past and really needs to be put into the dustbin of history. I think that became the national consensus right around this time.
We're talking with Dr. David Gibbs about Bloody Sunday and Selma, and really all of these laws. I mean, because of course, I mean, just I don't remember this, but certainly looking at the archival footage of an American president closing his speech with the rallying cry of the civil rights movement: "We shall overcome."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and this was Lyndon Johnson, who many in the civil rights community feared would be the worst president ever.
Naturally.
Yeah.
He's from a Confederate state. I mean, that can't be denied.
Yeah. I mean, and it turns out, arguably, no one did more.
That's right.
For the African American community than Lyndon Baines Johnson. He does not get the credit. And why do you think that is?
Johnson was a very complicated figure, and he was very much a very unpleasant personality, a bully. As we know, the biggest stain on his administration, on his presidency, of course, was the catastrophe of Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Very much is on his shoulders. And at the same time, he did do some remarkable things to advance the lives of common people, Black people and also white people, in the area of civil rights, also economic rights. It's hard to say. I mean, part of it was political expediency. He was responding to a national attitude that was changing right before his eyes. On the other hand, he wasn't altogether terrible in things like civil rights earlier in his career.
Yeah,
he was not. I mean, he wasn't at the forefront of it, but he wasn't altogether hostile to the idea of civil rights. So he wasn't a singular monster, that's for sure. Nor was he. I mean, he certainly was an opportunist. He was very much a politician, and much of it was responding to events on the street, events that were happening on the street and that were being seen by everybody in the United States and in the world through television. But also, I think that he was open to the idea as well. So it wasn't like he had to be pushed kicking and screaming into enacting civil rights legislation. I think up to a point, he himself seemed to believe in it as an idea. And as I said, I think the foreign policy establishment and every president is very heavily influenced by foreign policy. I've said this before. I think they were quietly whispering in his ear that it would be very good for U.S. international image and the Cold War if we could get rid of this artifact of segregation, because it's so damaging to America's image overseas. I think that was a big factor in this, actually, was the Cold War.
Okay. Well, I mean, indeed, it was the picture of Black children being hosed and bitten by police on the cover of Pravda.
Yeah, I'm sure. Oh, yeah, the Soviets didn't fail to make note of this. Other countries, actually, in France, apparently, this elicited a lot of condemnation as well. There were multiple factors here, and I think there were multiple influences on Johnson personally, but I suspect had I been around at the time, I would have hated Johnson over Vietnam. But in retrospect, I see him as more of a positive figure historically than a negative one. The accomplishments he had at the domestic level, including very definitely the Civil Rights Act and his 24th Amendment, these were pretty remarkable accomplishments, as were Medicare and Medicaid, which helped elderly people. I mean, there were all sorts of breakthrough domestic programs. I think in retrospect, over time, he started to look somewhat better than he did when he left office in 69, excuse me.
Oh, yes. I mean, those were such tumultuous times.
Definitely.
And maybe by the time we got to the 70s, we thought we'd have a breather, but that did not happen.
I don't know.
Talk to me.
Well, you had a crisis in the 1970s. I mean, up till the 70s, you really had what I would call the extended New Deal, where the benefits of the New Deal were intensified, including by Johnson, but others as well, in which you had, higher levels of economic growth. The economy performed very well. You had not full employment, but moderately close to full employment. And ordinary people had major improvements in their lives that they'd never seen before and had the reason to believe their children would do even better than they did. And this would just go on and on. And the gap between the rich and poor, which was still huge, was much narrower than it ever had been in American history. I should add also, the racial wage gap was narrowing dramatically during this period. Actually, believe it or not, there was a study in the American Economic Review some time ago that actually African Americans from the 40s onward saw their incomes go up, admittedly from a very low base, but Black incomes went up more rapidly than white incomes. So the racial wage gap was closing rapidly. In the 1970s, you had a crisis, and the good times came to an end, and the economy performed very weakly. Wages were mostly stagnant. You had very little growth, or relatively little growth in the economy. You had very deep recessions. The good times came to an end. Why they came to an end is a complicated story, but the important thing is they did come to an end. And the question is, who's going to pay for this? What happened is that I should add, by the way, something else is the wealthy were not doing well in the 70s either. Nobody was, but the wealthy were doing especially badly.
Why?
Profit rates reached historic lows.
Okay.
Low rates of profit. And believe it or not, I know this isn't well known. Inflation then, it's not really true now, but in the 70s, the inflation of the 70s, inflation was very high. That was one of the defining features. It affected the wealthy more than it did the working classes, at least in distributional terms, in terms of the people who lost the most money were the very wealthy. The reason is it's very hard. The wealthy like to not only store their wealth and maintain, but like to grow it, and tends to grow over time. And it just grows and grows and grows. In inflation, it's very hard to even maintain the value of your wealth, let alone grow it. And so the value of great fortunes tended to erode in the 70s. And so the wealthy were getting it, you might say, a double whammy. On the one hand, low profit rates. On the other hand, their fortunes were being eroded through high inflation. Nobody was doing well in the 70s, but believe it or not, the rich were even doing worse than everyone else.
Really?
Yes, they were. And the distribution of wealth became actually the narrowest ever in American history was the 70s because of that, because the rich were doing poorly. And so you had what I called a revolt of the rich. Up until then, I think wealthy people had accepted the New Deal with some reluctance, but they felt that the growth rates are high and they were doing well, not as well relatively as they used to, but well. And I think wealthy people accepted that we live in a democracy and the common people will have a say, and there would be no going back to the conditions of before the Depression. And that unions were here to stay and the welfare state was here to stay. And that was, the wealthy mostly accepted that. In the 70s, they changed their mind. And what I did is I went through the archives. I'm a historian. I go to archives and look through private papers of wealthy people and what they were saying to each other. And what they're saying to each other is, we can't go on like this. And if somebody has to pay, it better not be us. And they talked like they were a aggrieved party. They talked like they were downtrodden peasants. I had a quote from one CEO who said something to the effect that the most downtrodden, oppressed minority in America is corporate executives. And it wasn't a joke. All right. It's a self-pity, very, very deep self-pity.
Well, what was it a reaction to? Yeah, because it's like we saw this in the post-slavery period. Because Black people came out of slavery determined to make it.
Yeah.
And that's what we were doing.
Yeah.
And there was pushback. Do you think, I mean, and in the 70s, and I'm a child of that period, of the 70s and 80s, you saw Black people really break through.
Breakthrough, I'm sorry. What do you mean?
You saw Black people break through culturally into the so-called mainstream.
Yep.
I mean, Sammy Davis cannot be credited enough for all that he did to break us into the top rungs of show business.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, he did that. And by being the brunt of jokes, taking all these hits, although Frank Sinatra was someone who was his friend, and did so much. That having been said, and then Motown broke down these doors. The cultural doors were broken down. Dr. King, in his death, it took many, many years, but he was transitioned into, he was almost deified. And so in some quarters, you had Bill Cosby. I mean, and then you had Black people emerging in sports.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like we went from being in the kitchen to being on the menu to, well, didn't quite have seats at the table, but we were around. I mean, do you think that this is what was inspiring, say, the Bakke case?
Well, there's no question there's always been a certain zero-sum attitude among white people, a certain threat that Black people represented to their status, their jobs, everything, educational opportunities. I think that there certainly was a certain competitiveness and a kind of, this is especially true, I think, it's kind of regrettable, lower income groups, people who have less are naturally going to be much more protective of what little they have. And also they're concerned about their status. And so I think all of these things played into a certain racial animosity. People forget how segregated not just the South, but the North was during this period. Boston, one thinks of that as like, liberal Boston. It was a very segregated city in the early 70s.
And we did see the hostilities break out.
That's right. The second phase of desegregation was in the North. And Boston was the leading example of that. It was a little different than the South because you didn't have this formal legal segregation. What you had is informal segregation of residents due to redlining and also just intimidation. Black family moved into a neighborhood in Boston. Sometimes they'd be beaten up or have their house firebombed or something like that. So you had this racial segregation in residence. As a result of that, the schools were segregated. In a sense, it wasn't that different from the South. The only difference was there weren't laws forbidding, Black people to attend white schools. You didn't have that. But what instead you had was an informal segregation that was, in some ways, just as intense, and not really that different in some respects. And so you had court orders that demanded what was called busing. That the best way to rectify this is that Black children attending completely segregated Black schools would get in buses and go across town to a white school, and white kids would do the same and go to a Black school, and that would integrate. I might add, in Boston, there were efforts to do this voluntarily, to urge white communities to do this voluntarily, to begin to desegregate, but they staunchly refused. They just wouldn't do it. So finally, we had a court order in 1974, Judge Garrity just insisted by order of law, they were going to bus children. And that was that. and there was an explosion of violence. It got really ugly, and it got quite nasty, and dangerous, for very dangerous. And Boston was really the most famous case, but it was happening all over the country. And so I think part of the problem was ingrained racism, and the fact that basically there was a determination in many white communities not to desegregate. But there's something else, which is a lot of this occurred in 1974, which was the height of the worst recession the United States had since the 30s. And so people already were in a very bad mood. So that didn't help. One other thing that didn't help is that Judge Garrity, I think, was mostly a very honorable person. I think, who was acting according to good motives. He did do something that I think was open to question, which is that the first schools to be desegregated were in the poorest parts of the city: Roxbury, the poor black community, and South Boston, which was not as poor as Roxbury, but very poor still. And so it was the poorest segment areas that were subjected to this, not the more wealthy areas, and of course not the outlying areas, which were not affected. I mean, it's areas outside of Boston proper. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Judge Garrity's children, I believe, went to private school. Or no, they went to schools. No, forgive me. They went to high-income schools in high-income areas outside of Boston that were not affected by busing. And that was something that rankled people. And but mostly I think it was people in my communities just were not willing to desegregate, and this was a matter of determination. And so you did have a new wave of racial violence and racial antagonism that occurred during this period. And an interesting thing is that I think in the Black community, there's the Congressional Black Caucus, which was already organized at this time. And my impression was that they were very shaken by the stridency of the reaction to desegregation in Boston and elsewhere in the North, but especially Boston. And they were sufficiently shaken, they started thinking outside the box. How do we handle this? What do we do about this? And they came up with an inventive idea, which is to come up with a new program that would draw whites and blacks together, not affluent whites, but working class whites together with blacks around an economic program, something that would benefit both groups, that would get away from this zero-sum attitude of your gain is my loss, to try and get away from that and demonstrate common ground. And so they came out in 1974 with the idea of full employment. This is an idea that had been around during the New Deal. Roosevelt himself had proposed it. Some of the top economists in the 40s proposed it. And they revived the idea that a guaranteed full employment by law, that if you can't find a job, the government is required to create a job for you, as Roosevelt did during the Depression. And they teamed up with Senator Hubert Humphrey, the former vice president. It wasn't really his idea. It was more Hawkins, who was the chair of the Black Caucus, a black congressman from LA. But Hawkins was not a national figure. Humphrey was. The idea was Humphrey would bring national prominence into this. And so they created the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Bill, which is a revival of, as I said, ideas during the 40s of guaranteed full employment. And the idea was, again, that, well, first of all, there was obviously black people had an interest in this because black unemployment, particularly among young black males, is higher than average. So this was an important black issue, clearly, but it was also a national issue. It wasn't just blacks who were affected by this at all. And so this was proposed before Congress. I think the problem you had is that the economics profession was much more conservative by this time. It received almost no support among economists. Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, because it's interesting looking back, because as a child, I'm unaware of this. You know what I mean? I'm aware, but I'm not, because I'm from...
That's significant. That's very significant, because I think it didn't get enough publicity. The mainstream media just totally was uninterested in it. And there was no internet then, so it was the mainstream media was nothing.
Well, I mean, but see, and because, this is a world that these kids don't know, that you got the morning edition of the paper and the evening edition.
That's right.
I mean, and everybody watched Walter Cronkite or Roger Mudd or Eric Sevareid. Yeah. Oh, I'm going back. And it was in that context that we began to see the attacks upon the policies that hastened the advancement of black people, right? You saw When I remember when Baki won his decision, my parents said, "Oh, it's going to be hard for you all." I thought, okay, and here we are. He wants to bring Afrikaners here. I mean, you just can't make this up. You know, you. I mean, these government employees can't get into the buildings where they work.
It's crazy stuff.
It is crazy. And so, what were the rich thinking in the
This is
say
what
in the post civil rights movement? Well, I mean, what was on their minds?
this is what
Because it feels like they have a coordinated plan.
yeah, they did. They
Okay.
did. What I found, I have to say, I was very impressed by the fact they were very well organized, and that basically they came up with a plan. They were very disciplined in putting forward their plan and implementing it. Uh, some of the people who were their political heavies, a man named Paul Weyrich from
Yeah.
Heritage Foundation, founded the Heritage Foundation. He was very smart. I have to say this. People like Milton Friedman were not just economists, but he was like a political orchestrator. When I look at their private papers and what they were saying to each other, what they were doing, it was a little bit like generals organizing armies for a military offensive. They were that disciplined. It was like that. The left never does this, at least not in recent years. But the right does it. They do it incredibly effectively. I have to say, it was actually the civil rights movement did that to some extent. They were very calculating in how they orchestrated, including Selma. This wasn't an accident that they did Selma. This was planned out very carefully by people like King and others. But I think that tradition was lost by the left in the 70s. In the 70s, it was much more spontaneous. Whereas the right, they did strategy. And the strategy was this. They wanted to redistribute wealth upwards in their favor. And they realized that's very difficult to do in a democracy. How on earth can you do that? And I saw interviews with Weyrich where he talked about this, and he said that we tried going to working class communities and talking about cutting business taxes, and people hate that. We gave it up right away because it didn't work. So what we came up with was several things. First of all, race. Race is a great divider. That works. If you're rich, racial divisions it's what you want because it divides the working class. There'll be no opposition because they're divided. Another one is religion. Dividing people by religion. In other words, lifestyle. You had the counterculture, and you had a traditionalist reaction against the counterculture. And so Weyrich was and he laid it out, and he said, we were going to use the cultural issues and race, to sell our ideas subtly under the table while everybody's distract everybody, basically, with these issues. And while they're not looking, we'll cut taxes on the rich, we'll deregulate industry, will impose austerity as ways of fighting inflation, raising unemployment and putting the burden on the working classes rather than on the rich. And we'll do all these things while nobody's looking because they're fighting about affirmative action and fighting about, the hippies and long hair and, gay rights and these kinds of things. And these are, by the way, there's no question there were some real accomplishments here in the 70s, including gay rights, which was a new idea, women's rights, and there was desegregation in spite of all the riots. But the thing is, the people like Weyrich said, we'll just fund, we'll just fund, and we'll have the rich pour money into these things. We'll just fund a backlash. And so the backlash wasn't an accident. The Christian right wasn't an accident either. You had very wealthy people pouring vast sums of money, including a lot of people were not religious at all, but they liked the Christian right because it distracted people. That was their focus. I'm sorry. Do you want to cut in? I'm talking a lot here.
No. I'm looking because I'm watching some of these messages come through. I mean, because the White House things pop every 5 minutes, so I'm trying to keep up and maybe add it to the conversation if we need to, but keep on talking. Because see, this is my thing. As I'm looking at, and we've talked about this, Dr. Gibbs, the oligarchs. Dick Durbin, the senior senator from the great state of Illinois, said during the 2008 crisis, he shrugged his shoulders and it looked like he had just given up. He said, look, the bankers run the place. Now we're seeing the oligarchs run the place. We're seeing it. But what you propose is that this did not happen yesterday.
That's right.
This is a because you fail if you fail to plan. My father often says you plan to fail. One thing you say about the Republicans, they in the main don't like Donald Trump,
That's
but
right.
they acknowledge his popularity and they said, okay, we'll ride this horse. I want to go back to the Donald Trump of his precursor, Reagan, who they pulled out of Hollywood and started fashioning 40s, 50s, 60s. And by the 70s, he was on his way to become, I mean, you saw that he was a contender for the presidency. And at the end of the decade, like everything else, he had, he and the Bloomingdales and everybody else who were behind him had achieved that goal. So I want to go back there.
Right.
Because what happened after all these great victories were won, where you were closing the wealth gap, you were closing the class divide,
That's right.
and then I look at Boston, which is supposed to be a liberal city, and I see a black man speared by the American flag.
Mm.
So by the time 1981 rolls around, I'm accepted at Harvard. I'm up there for the weekend to look at, their schools. My father said, no, you need to go because they have a pre-freshman weekend and you need to at least make an educated decision.
Right.
And so I asked, I guess the question you're not supposed to ask, I said, are there any uncomfortable spaces in Boston? I'm like, I don't know other people's travel patterns, but I've been here many times. Oh, you would, I mean, they even tell you that in France, you will find areas of discomfort. So don't go there, right? And I want to go back to that period because this was also a period where I saw black people moving. Women didn't need a man to co-sign the mortgage. All this happened in that decade too.
That's right.
I didn't need you to get a credit card for me. Yep. I mean, Mary Tyler Moore is showing me, and I'd gone from that girl to her. All these things, there was all of these great things happening. Mm-hmm. But you said, wait, something else was happening too.
There's a backlash.
There's a backlash. These people were plotting and planning. And that's what I want to hear. Because I feel like we're watching the fruition of it.
We are. Well, woke, you hear the war about woke, fighting over woke.
Yes.
Well, fighting over woke, you get people like Elon Musk who are taking apart the entire federal government, no doubt in his own interest. And the word woke didn't exist in the 70s, but the basic idea was there. What I do see, though, is that as right now, basically, people like Musk now and in the 70s were using the culture wars as a means of distracting people so they could get their way. What's very striking, again, that rise of the Christian right, this happened, of course, in the 70s. And what's astonishing about it is the extent to which the huge amounts of money that were poured into the Christian right by the oligarchs of the day. And the idea basically was to build them up and also make them bulwark for not just culturally conservative issues, but free market economics. You had Jerry Falwell, not only preaching against the evils of, sex and movies and that kind of thing, but also he was preaching the virtues of Milton Friedman and the free market is in the New Testament and so on. And that was not an accident. That was thought up by people outside of the church. The right was very clever, I have to say, deeply unethical, but clever. And the left was not. The left really was very unclever. I think a big problem you had, something I've been talking on the show frequently is how it disturbs me the extent to which the left has become very posh and very upper crust and uses a lot of very needless jargon that alienates people. That began in the 70s. And as a result of that, the left really didn't really have that much interest in working people, didn't appeal to working people, and couldn't because their jargon was just so alienating and style was so alienating. What that meant basically is the right would do it instead. And so I think the beginning of taking working class people, especially working class whites, of course, and mobilizing them for the right making possible this shift in economic policy that favored the very wealthy. Um, and the left didn't really have any opposition. The left offered almost no opposition to it, as a very striking thing. There was very little opposition. In a lot of ways, once the right really got mobilized and they really were moving, the image I had was a knife through butter. There really wasn't that much resistance to what they were doing. The only real program from the left to deal with the economic crisis of the 70s was the Humphrey Hawkins bill coming from the Black Caucus. And that was defeated because it just didn't have enough support. And ultimately, Carter signed the bill into law, but it said nothing. It was just a lot of pablum. It just encouraged. It said unemployment would be nice. That's really all it said. There was no requirement of full employment. Excuse me, full employment would be nice, but it didn't require full employment. And so, really, one of the problems you had is the right had a program. The program was deregulation and cut taxes, especially for the rich. That was the program. That's a program. The left had no program. After the only program they had was Humphrey Hawkins, and when that went down, the left didn't have any program. So that's another reason the right won. They had a program.
They had a program, and clearly they enacted it.
Oh yes.
So I mean, did they plan to widen the class divide? Was
Yes.
it plan? Why is it to their advantage to have this class divide? To me, it's socially unsustainable.
Well,
To
it's
have all these wealthy people to have, well, should I say, these few wealthy people, and everybody else is scrambling for crumbs.
there's no doubt there are huge social costs, including political instability, increases in crime, which is very expensive, costs a lot of money. I think during the period of the 50s and 40s, 50s, and 60s, many wealthy people accepted the idea of a narrowing of the wealth gap because they felt stability was in their interest. But in the 70s, they gave up on that. There really was a change, a sea change in the attitudes of the wealthy in the 70s.
There was.
I'm sorry?
There was not.
There was.
There
There
was.
was.
Okay, because I thought.
There was.
Okay.
There was no change in the public. By the way, it's a myth that the public favored these things. They didn't. All the public opinion polls show this. The public continued to favor progressive taxation on the wealthy. They continued to favor federal aid to the indigent. This didn't change. There was no change, significant change in public opinion on the economic issues. It was the wealthy that changed their attitude. The tiny number of very wealthy people. And they organized and they poured money into the political process. They engaged in what I would call deep lobbying. They didn't just lobby politicians. They lobbied the whole climate of opinion. That's deep lobbying climate of this public opinion, the climate of opinion is much more effective than just lobbying for legislation, because if you can change the whole tone of conversation of the ideology, that's much longer lasting. And that's what they wanted. That's what they got.
That's what they wanted, and that's what they got. And look at what we got, hammered.
That's right. There was a tremendous return to pre-New Deal inequality. Misery, also decline in living standards for most people. The wages stayed low for decades.
But again, I ask, how is that to their advantage?
I think, again, they thought of it just in terms of, in short-term terms. They didn't think of the long term.
Okay.
I think it became very increasingly short-term. I think there was a period in the 50s and 60s when the very wealthy thought in long-term. But that changed in the 70s. Increasingly, focus was the next quarterly report or the next year at most. There was very much an attitude of we're interested in lining our pockets now, which they did very successfully.
Well, they have no success. My question for you then is, because they have opened up the class divide, and we really saw that come alive with Reagan. But before we get to him, because I think like the culmination of that, I would not even say it was Trump. I would say it was Reagan, who then got us to Trump, right? Or am I wrong? I mean, help me.
There were a lot of precursors to Trump, but certainly Reagan was one. There's no doubt that I should add, it is true in the latter part of the Carter presidency, a lot of the shift in economic policy did begin towards the latter part of the Carter presidency. Deregulation, particularly finance, that began under Carter. Changing tax policy in favor of the rich, that began under Carter. It's remarkable how anti-union the Carter presidency was. I think part of that, people forget that the South was mostly a union-free zone. as it is today. And Carter spent his whole life in Georgia, and it is true he did somewhat defy the racist consensus on the issue of race. He did do that, and it's to his credit he did that. But on unions, I think he followed the consensus, which was unions are unnecessary. We don't have them in Georgia. Why do we need them nationally? And so he had a very anti-union policy. And so that was another issue. Also, it must be said that he followed a policy of doing what finance wanted, which is that he did fight inflation through producing the worst recession ever, sky-high unemployment, and lowering wages for decades. And that really did begin with Carter. He appointed Paul Volcker to the Federal Reserve. And Paul Volcker was the protege of David Rockefeller. He initially offered it to David Rockefeller, but David Rockefeller turned it down and recommended his protege, Volcker. And Volcker was a follower of Milton Friedman. And basically, he followed the monetary policy recommended by Milton Friedman called monetarism and produced sky-high unemployment and just wiped out whole segments of high-paying jobs for good. The claim was that this would only be temporary. There'd be temporary suffering followed by improved conditions. It was not temporary. This was for good. This was a permanent change for most people. Wages never recovered.
It never did. I mean, you said, no, this was not temporary. This was for good.
That's right.
And, I feel like it. It feels like it is for good. My mother said, my generation couldn't wait to become adult enough and successful enough to be able to send something to our parents. I said, Mom, that's not the reality now. Now, the University of Chicago, where Dad went to school, is $100,000 a year for an undergraduate. NYU, Columbia, it's all of that.
It's shocking. It's pretty shocking. That was until then, the idea of, at least at state universities, education was pretty close to free. At CUNY, City University of New York, it was completely free. All right, it was in the 70s that you began moving to the model advocated by Milton Friedman of, paying market rates of tuition, and then you could go into debt, and the federal government could lend you money, or at least could orchestrate the lending of money. The banks actually lent the money, and so now basically we have the model, and tuition increased much more rapidly than inflation, and you have this extraordinary debt burden. With people paying off college loans for decades. It's a very widespread problem. That problem began in the 70s. It was the 70s that produced so many of the dysfunctions we have now.
And that's what the book set up for me, that these seeds were planted.
That's right.
And they were nurtured. But now what we're watching today is like Reagan, who was someone who had been incubated.
He had been incubated. That's quite right. General Electric financed him early in his acting career and helped make him a political figure.
What? Because I want you to come back and talk about this more, because I think we're paying more attention to the super rich and the class divide, which I think is it's a very interesting conversation to have in the American conversation, because we don't have the class issues that they have in Great Britain and around the world. And what say you about that?
In many ways, it's worse. Historically, Europe was, in fact, a much bigger class divide than the United States. It is true, historically. That changed during the 50s and 60s. Well, actually, forgive me. That changed in the 70s and 80s. And basically, the United States became the leader in having a class divide. Europe did retain most of its welfare state. It was denuded under Thatcher in Britain, but they still had the National Health Service. And so the U.S. achieved extraordinarily high levels of inequality, much higher. U.S. is an outlier. The U.S. has, I don't know where we rank now, but in terms of life expectancy, healthcare, we're below Cuba, below Costa Rica. We have shorter life expectancy than any country, at least in Western Europe. And so in a lot of ways, we're a rich country with extraordinary backwardness and poverty. That's remarkable. And a lot of this came out of the 70s. Until the 70s, I don't think it was so bad. So the 70s really was an inflection point in U.S. history. And, I think that the culture wars and above all, the issue of race was a very significant factor because this is what enabled it to happen. W.E.B. Du Bois said 100 years ago that one of the great tragedies, the American tragedy, is that we don't really have a working class movement, a working class party, partly because of this racial divide. And if you're an elite, if you're a corporate executive, and you are unethical, as most of them are, you like the idea of a racial divide. Of course you want to encourage it, because that means you don't have unions, you don't have a working class party, you don't really have any opposition.
That's what I'm saying. And it seems purposeful.
Oh yes, it's not accidental. Well, I mean, some of it obviously is just the deep history of the United States. We all know about that, but it was encouraged from the top by people with an interest in encouraging it. There's no doubt about that. If you read C. Van Woodward's The Strange Career of Jim Crow, basically Southern elites saw segregation as a solution to the problem of populism. They were worried about a black-white coalition opposing elite interests. Segregation is a solution to the problem. That was their solution.
It's amazing how these things happen. And we think they come out of the ground. We just think, we think that that 2025 just happened, that Elon Musk just happened. And what you're saying is, oh, no, 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 no. Immediately, as soon as you got these rights, they started meeting. They created talk radio because it was created by them for them. And I think they studied Dr. King. I think they studied Reverend Jackson, these ministers who were able to completely change American life and public policy. And then we got Jerry Falwell and some others who could talk that talk and seemingly walk that walk. And wow. And here we are. We only have a couple minutes left, but I want you to come back and talk about this, because I think now everybody's talking about the oligarchs who are the unelected tech bros who are in the cabinet. Because I think that Elon Musk is a symbol, but he's not the only one, everybody.
No, he's not the only one. Peter Thiel, David Sachs, there's a whole coterie. The Democrats have a coterie too. Let's not forget that Harris received significantly more money from the top than Trump did. I think that the oligarchs, most of them, there are exceptions clearly, but I think the oligarchs were more inclined to support Harris and Biden just because they're reliable, they're predictable. Trump's not predictable. I don't think the very rich like unpredictable. They're unnerved by that. So I think this is a bipartisan tendency, the idea basically of relying upon the oligarchs for support. Trump does it, the Democrats do it too.
Oops, you're going to get into trouble for that. But did you say Trump? But it's true.
It's true.
I mean, same people who are under Trump now, they would have run under Kamala.
Yeah. Well, they would have been made different oligarchs, but they would have been oligarchs, basically.
They would have been oligarchs nonetheless.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as we're looking at this moment, and this is my final question for now, because I'm going to have you come back and talk about this some more, because like I said, anytime, because Elon Musk is in our cabinet meeting, and I say our because it's our country.
Yes.
And he is firing people. It's like this long march that they've been on. This is part of the destination. It took them 5 decades, right? But they were ever faithful. So, I mean, just help us to understand, just going out a couple of days. I mean, just moving forward just a couple of days, because I don't know what's going to happen by the time.
Nobody does. Weird times right now.
Yeah. What should we be looking for?
What I'm saying is, I think that the Republicans, particularly Musk, is overreaching here, and he's just so many programs so quickly. It's just very destabilizing to the whole country, to the economy. Mm-hmm. But also, he's got popular programs, things like the, what is it, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau set up by Warren. That's a popular program, and that seems to be dismantled, or he's got it in the process of being dismantled. There is a lot of speculation Social Security is under attack, or at least the Social Security Administration is under attack. If people have questions about Social Security, they may call and nobody may answer the phone, nobody may respond. I think that the dismantling of large parts of the federal government it may look clever, or they may think it's clever. I suspect in a fairly short period of time, people are going to start to resent this overstepping that they're doing, especially if it starts cutting. If we start seeing cuts to basic programs like Social Security or Medicaid, it's going to be very damaging to Trump. I'm sure he must realize that. And I think that's one of the reasons we're starting to see some pushback against Musk. 'Cause I think there are people in the cabinet. Well, there's obviously just rivalry in the cabinet. There's always rivalry, but I think there's some recognition that Trump may be overreaching here in a way that may be very damaging to the
But
whole.
with these hidden hands
Yeah.
running so much, can he stop this train?
Well, we'll see. I don't know. I think that Trump, until now, I think is like the sense of dynamism and spirit, I suppose, and energy that's shock and awe being displayed by Musk. I think Trump likes a sort of bullying tone. He himself knows the idea of bullying. He's very familiar with that attitude. But I wonder if he's going to start seeing Musk as somebody who's out of control. Above all, is not in Trump's interest, because I think that's the number one consideration here from the standpoint of Trump, his personal interest. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing a lower profile for Musk in the future. The big question is, Trump came into office with one of the lowest popularity ratings in history. And I think it just barely squeaked above 50%. Now it's gradually going down. It's a little below 50% now. So he doesn't have very much room to maneuver. And so he never really had a honeymoon. Most presidents have a honeymoon. Trump did not. And so the question is, can he even maintain what he has now? And my guess is that he's at a very high risk of not maintaining popular support and losing control, certainly of the House of Representatives, possibly the Senate in the next midterm elections. He's going to have to worry about that. And I hope that puts some constraint on some of the more damaging things that he's been doing.
The rich are revolting. The revolt of the rich. And I don't mean revulsion. It's like they have been pushing for a small government, a stripped down government. They're talking about only the USPS service. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just there's so much that they're looking at, not taking the government apart to put it back together and again and throw out that which is wasteful.
No, they're going
But
to be
no, I'll carry the bloat. You know, I got this. I mean, that's what I see.
Yeah.
So,
that's what's happening, yes.
well, what's your closing thought? Because there's a whole lot to look at and look for.
Well, in evaluating Trump, there's a lot here that's new. His style is very new. I mean, if you looked at a lot of his public presentations, they're extremely unprecedented. And a lot of the personal hatred and partisan hatred is unprecedented. But a lot of what Trump's doing is very standard Republican playbook, especially since the 70s. A lot of this is Reaganism on steroids. And so I think we need to see this in the context of the last 50 years for free market economics being the driving force in both parties, but maybe a little more in the Republican Party. And now is very much the driving force in the Trump administration.
Well, I think we're going to have to continue to, okay, I'm looking here and I'm looking there. Because the reason I keep looking is because every day, every time I turn on the television, every time I change the channel, something else has changed. And now they're saying that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are on the chopping block. That's going to be
devastating to Trump if he starts messing with Social Security. That'll be very, very damaging to him, especially because I believe he had significant votes from older people. And that's not going to be popular.
Well, Martin O'Malley, the former governor of Maryland, who was head of the Social Security administration, said 30 to 90 days, everybody start saving your money. I said,
well, I mean, we'll see what he does. I mean, I would be surprised if he really goes through with this, just because it would be so damaging to him politically. On the other hand, I can't predict the future. I don't know what he'll do.
Oh my gosh. Well, you know what I'm going to do? You can't predict the future, but what's past is prologue. And I think that as we study the 70s, when so many of us felt that was like the last free period, you said, some people, you might have been breathing easier. Some people said, we're going to get this, we're going to change this. And they were planning all along. And I think that we have to understand, Dr. Gibbs, that's why I want you to go into even greater detail.
All right,
Because
sure.
we need to understand. Well, I know I was asking you a lot of questions, but we need to understand that some people are planning and plot. What did Dr. King say? Evil men plot, therefore good men must plan.
That's right. I think that again, what I'm seeing is, I have to say, in some ways, I think the left start thinking a little bit like the right does. What I mean by that is we have to plan. We can't just do what feels good at the moment. We can't just be spontaneous. We have to plan and start thinking about being effective.
Yeah.
Um, the right does that all the time. They've been doing it for decades. It's time for the left to start thinking in those terms.
Dr. David Gibbs, everybody, you've got to get the Revolt of the Rich. If you want to know why we're here, and you need to know why we're here, so you can see this coming at us again, because they're not done. They've only just begun.
They've only begun.
While Elon Musk is having a fight with Marco Rubio's got to oversee $400 million in payments received from Elon Musk to get these strange looking vehicles that they're driving all over the place. Dr. David Gibbs, everybody, the Revolt of the Rich, how the politics of the 1970s widened America's class divide. We have a class issue, many of them. Racism is a form of classism.
Mhm.
And so everybody, all these isms, yeah, and I feel like we have been toyed with, Dr. Gibbs, so that we will be at each other's throats instead of at each other's sides.
That's right.
So I can't wait to have you back, because we're going to talk about this, because I think um, this is where we are. This book tells me why we are the way we are, why we are where we are. All of the things that were happening in the 70s that no one discussed, he's got them in this book. These people, now I understand why my father was on the road so much. Because, well, Dr. King said, evil men plot, therefore good men must plan. And that's what you have to do. Sending you so much love, everybody. I wish you the best. I am going to step away for a day. I've got to go to Roberta Flack's funeral. I'm privileged to be a part of it. I sang backup for her for 5 years. And she'd been like a godmother to me. She was
Great musician.
great musician, a great human being. She was accepted at Howard University at the age of 13.
Mm.
But her parents made her wait until she was a mighty, mighty 15. He said, now we can't hold you back academically, but what we can do is make sure that you're with the right people. And that you will be old enough to, she was always precocious, but her parents wanted to make sure that she would be all right. And she was getting her PhD, writing her dissertation when she signed with Atlantic Records and moved into Legend. And so I thank God for Roberta Flack today. And everybody, God bless you. Thank God for you, Dr. David Gibbs, for being so vigilant, for helping us to understand, no, these people are planning.
Yeah.
All the time. They don't sleep. They don't sleep. Dr. David Gibbs, everybody. The Revolt of the Rich. Get that book. Get it. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive.